Those things that you like,
Mask
okay,
off,
right
yes, exactly.
hustle, 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 and get ready for service. I have an enormous sweet tooth. I got 2 pastries from the bakery this morning. At the same time, it's like bang, bang, bang. I need that dish 5 minutes ago. Why are you late? Everything else is
Yeah.
I could do marine biology. That was just like, yep, that's what's happening. That's what I'm doing. Absolutely.
I'm not sure, like if they, you can ask them to warm it up, or if you want. Yes.
Yes.
And what do you think?
So I'm probably going to go for a breakfast pastry because that's like my favorite thing. And I'm thinking the apple turnover might be good.
Yeah, I love this.
I might need to get more than one.
It's like an almond croissant.
Yeah.
I love them.
Yeah,
I will take an almond or like a chocolate almond croissant. Exactly. Rebecca, I'm so excited to have an interview with you, and I know actually not so much about you. I know that you're learning a Dolphins language, studying Dolphins language, and that you're here in San Diego. But tell me exactly what you're doing currently. Like, how does your workday look like?
Right now I'm working on a PhD at Scripps Institution of Oceanography, and my focus is using acoustics to study marine mammals. And so essentially what we do in my lab is we go out and we deploy instruments that sit on the seafloor, and they just record all ocean noise for long periods of time, 9 months, a year, sometimes more, depending on the batteries that we've fitted them with. And then we'll go back and pick up those devices, and that's when the real work starts of analyzing all that data and trying to understand what you recorded. So what I've been focusing on is trying to understand patterns of distribution and abundance of toothed whales. So that includes all the dolphins and sperm whales and beaked whales, everything that echolocates pretty much. And so I'm starting from the acoustic data. The first step is we have to be able to tell these animals apart in the sound data, right? And so recently what I've been working on the last several months is a neural net-based classifier which can distinguish different species echolocation clicks. Once we've got that up and running well, which right now I'm evaluating its performance. It seems to be doing pretty well, but we've still got to really check it out and understand how it's doing. But once we've got that performing where we want it, then the next step will be just applying that to a bunch of our data from our monitoring stations. And I'm actually working mostly with data on the East Coast. So we have 11 different stations on the East Coast, ranging from New England all the way down to Jacksonville, Florida. And we've been deploying these recording instruments at these stations for the last several years. So we have about 3 years of data at each station. And so the idea is I have my classifier built. Once I'm happy with its performance, I will use it to classify data from 3 years at each of these stations. And then I can understand what species are present at each station, how those presences change seasonally or between the years. And then the final step would be trying to understand what drives those changes in species presence and abundance. And that's called habitat modeling, where you construct a statistical and mathematical model which looks at the influence of various, we call it covariates, but other environmental factors. It could be the water temperature, it could be the prey availability, it could be the level of human activity, and try and understand how all of these other factors in the environment determine where the animals go and when, so that we can then understand better how to protect them and how to mitigate threats to them. Yeah.
So does it mean that different species, even within dolphins group, do they have different languages?
So I wouldn't call it different languages. Pretty much the only thing that I'm echolocation clicks. So dolphins are similar to bats in that they essentially emit sonar. Human sonar is based on the signals that bats and dolphins emit. We found that the animals did this, and we realized that this is a method that we could use for our own purposes. So what they do is they emit these very high-pitched clicks, little pings of sound, which actually come out of their forehead, their melon. It doesn't come out, you know, most other mammals, we have our sound-producing organs in our throat. But for marine mammals, the sound-producing organ, or at least for dolphins and toothed whales, the sound-producing organ is up closer to their nose, and then there's this whole apparatus that focuses the sound. It's called the melon. It's this big fatty organ in their forehead, and so the sound actually comes out their forehead. So they produce these clicks which come out their forehead. It'll bounce off of whatever is in front of them in the environment, and then they hear the echoes that come back. And based on the interpretation of those echoes, they have a very, very fine resolution understanding of exactly what's in their environment. Things like how far away objects are, what materials they're made of, and incredibly fine discrimination of size of materials. There's been some really great studies with dolphins done by the Navy where they can tell the difference between a metal ball that's 4 millimeters in diameter and a metal ball that's 5 millimeters in diameter. Like, they are so sophisticated in this.
Wow.
So it's incredible. So all of these toothed whale species use echolocation, but the characteristics of the clicks that they're sending out varies some between different species. And so this is what I'm trying to understand better. There's a handful of species who we can already really reliably identify in our data, and we know that always clicks that look like this and sound like this, we know it has to be this species. But then there's a whole handful of other species who we haven't quite sorted out yet, and we can only say, well, clicks that look and sound like this could be any one of these several. Mm-hmm. So that's what I'm trying to work on now, is to get a better understanding of exactly who is who in this kind of like messy group that we haven't discriminated yet.
It looks like you're working more with the data, but do you go in the ocean and communicate with or with species there, or like, work with species there underwater, or it's just tell me something.
So when I go out on boats, I go out to help deploy and recover the instruments that are sitting on the seafloor. For my work, I've never done what we call replay experiments, which is where you would actually go and you would emit sounds underwater and see how the animals react. I've never done that kind of work. Mm-hmm. A lot of that's been done to see how whales respond to the sounds of boats and sonar, like mm-hmm. naval sonar, and also to understand how animals respond to the sounds of their predators. And so you'll go and you'll play the sound of sonar at the same time as you have whales in the area, and you'll have observers tracking their response, or you may have tags mounted on the whale so that you can track their movement via GPS. Or you play the sounds of their predators and you see how their behavior changes. Maybe they stop vocalizing, maybe they flee, maybe they stop feeding. Mm-hmm. Different kinds of questions that you can address by doing these experiments. But that's not what I'm doing. Mm-hmm, so when I go out on boats, it's just to deploy and recover instruments. And most of my time is spent in the lab looking at this data on the computer.
But you haven't done this for all your life, right? Was it your dream job when you were a kid? Or
I think at some point I probably wanted to be a marine biologist. But no, when I was a young adult and trying to sort out my career, that was actually probably one of the furthest things from my mind. So after high school, I went to college and I got a degree in Italian literature. Mm-hmm. Actually, first I started as a music major and I was undecided. I didn't know what I wanted to do when I was younger. So somehow I ended up in Italian literature. I wanted to learn a language and study abroad, and that major allowed me to do that. But then when I finished undergrad, I didn't particularly want to become an Italian teacher or go to grad school at that point. I was really ready to be in what I thought of as the real world. I was done with school in my mind. And so after undergrad, I moved. Grew up in New York, and mm-hmm. I went to undergrad in Connecticut. And when I graduated, I moved out to San Francisco with a friend of mine from college. And my plan was to work in restaurants and learn how to bake professionally.
Okay.
And so this is something that kind of came about out of the blue in senior year of college. I'd always loved food and cooking and baking. But I had an opportunity to volunteer for the South Beach Wine and Food Festival during my senior year of college, because my aunt and my uncle have been longtime organizers of the festival. Mm-hmm. So I went down and I volunteered and I worked with all of these incredible professionals, and it kind of opened my eyes to this whole field that it never occurred to me that was an option, that could be a career path for me. But when I saw the level of passion and skill and dedication of people working in that field, I got really excited about it, and I kind of made up my mind pretty quickly that that's what I'm doing. That's it. I'm going to go for this. So I moved out to San Francisco with my friend from college. I didn't know anybody out there. I probably had about $3,000 to my name, and it was just a matter of sink or swim. I need to find some sort of job. I need to figure out how to become financially independent. Mm-hmm. The idea of moving back home with my parents to figure things out or to use that as a safety net, not optimal to me. I was so eager to be out in the world and making my own way. So I was really lucky in that, I did a few interviews for positions in restaurants in San Francisco, and I managed...
Without any experience,
right? With no experience.
With no experience,
right.
Okay.
But I managed to find a chef who had already built a pretty strong pastry team, and so she was willing to take somebody who had no experience and who would have to be trained from absolutely from the ground up.
Mm-hmm.
So that was the start of it. I started working in restaurants in San Francisco. I worked in, first it was a restaurant that was just opening, and so that was an interesting experience, seeing the whole process of getting the restaurant up and running. After about a year there, I moved to a well-established restaurant in the Mission called Delphina, run by Craig and Annie Stoll, and that was really a wonderful place to work. I was working for a pastry chef named Koa Duncan there, and she was really great, and it was just the two of us there, so it was a small team, so I got to learn a lot from her. And they actually won a James Beard Award during my time there, and it's still a very well-regarded, wonderful family-run restaurant. And then my next step was to Quince Restaurant, which at the time was in, oh my gosh, I can't even remember the name of the neighborhood.
In San Francisco,
I want to say Pacific Heights. Yeah, I want to say it was in Pacific Heights at that time, in a tiny little location. And during my time there, they moved to their current location in Nob Hill? No.
I'm not so familiar with San Francisco, so
it's been a long time since I lived there. Yeah. But they moved to a larger location, and working there, that was a Michelin-starred restaurant, so that was a whole nother level of complexity, of sophistication, of intensity, really. And I worked for a really incredibly talented pastry chef named William Werner there, and I learned a tremendous amount from him.
Do you remember the time when you tried something so good that you still can remember the taste of it?
Yes, actually, and it was the simplest thing. This was at the Hotel Plaza Athénée in Paris, which is, I didn't know at the time, but it's actually rated as the best hotel in Paris, so that already tells you something. But I was in Paris with my aunt and my cousin, and we went and had brunch at this hotel. And everything was beautiful. It was, it was a transcendent experience, but just a simple croissant. It wasn't even in a traditional rolled up croissant. It was just a little triangle of a croissant. But when I bit into it, it just, oh my gosh, it was like an epiphany. It just, it gives me chills, like remembering it. It just, the outer layer was just shattered, and the flavor of the butter was just so delicate, but so, that was the primary flavor. A croissant is all about the butter,
Right.
But between the flavor and the texture, it was just executed on a level that I have never experienced before or since. And I've made a point of seeking out great pastry, everywhere that I go, and I've enjoyed it in so many different places. But this one just really stands out to me as
like a pastry dough. It's the hardest for me.
There's a couple different doughs here. The dough that's used for the croissants it's what's called a laminated dough. So you take a regular dough and you fold it around a big block of butter, and then you roll it out and you fold it and roll it and fold it, so you end up with alternating layers of dough and butter. But for croissants, the dough you start with has yeast in it. For puff pastry, the dough you start with doesn't have yeast. So the only thing making it rise at that point is the butter.
But how many layers do you have to make? Like, it's a lot of work.
Oh, it's something like, for puff pastry, it's supposed to have something like 999 layers to be like perfect. Yeah, but there's a couple of different folding techniques that you use, so that every time you fold it, you're quadrupling or quintupling the layers. Right. So you end up only having to fold it, 4 or 5 times.
Okay. Yeah, I'm just so hungry, so just did some break.
Stuff my face real quick.
But one more thing, which I always wonder, if you especially work in such a high-end restaurants with so well-known chefs, do you have any disclosure when you go from one restaurant to another? You're not allowed to tell the secrets?
There definitely are plenty of chefs who are a little nervous about their recipes being taken by employees when they leave. But I think that's changing. I think that's kind of an older mindset. And now younger chefs kind of are more in an sharing and collaborative mindset. And so instead of hoarding your recipes and having these proprietary secrets that nobody can ever find out, it's more like, hey, I figured out how to make a really amazing product. I'm going to benefit from this. The people under me are going to learn about it. And it's kind of inevitable that they'll take those skills with them when they move on. But yeah, I think we're moving away from that.
That's actually nice. Hoarding. I like it. I like this attitude because others will also benefit from that, but also I will work on something else, right? Not just like holding something like for myself. And
I think it's also recognizing that the people who are working under you right now and learning from you, they're not going to be junior chefs forever, right? If they're passionate about this industry, they're going to try and move up and advance their own careers. And there's something to be said for training the next generation of leaders in your industry. And so if you can pass on these valuable skills, everybody will know that, oh, so-and-so trained under this well-known pastry chef. That's where all these skills came from, you know, and now look how well they're doing. So I don't know, it adds to your own prestige if you're able to
also
pass
builds
it along.
Community, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Nice. I like it. And but what's next?
So I spent a few years in San Francisco, worked in a handful of different restaurants, and that was a really great start. But one of the things that I had really wanted to do when I graduated college was to travel internationally a little bit. So I spent a few months traveling in New Zealand. I just kind of sold everything that I owned, which wasn't much in San Francisco. Sold everything, and I went to New Zealand for a few months, and I traveled around both islands for, it was about 3.5 months, I guess, and just tried to see and do as much as I could. And when I came back, I landed in New Orleans, and that's where I got my first job as a pastry chef. So until then, I was always a pastry cook, which meant that I was working under a more established chef and executing their ideas and their recipes. But now in this position in New Orleans at Stella Restaurant, I was the chef, and it was up to me to develop recipes, to come up with menu ideas, to, if necessary, hire other people to help me get everything done and to actually put the food out during dinner service. So that was a whole new game. I didn't quite know what I was getting myself into.
It's a lot of responsibility, right?
It's a lot. It's kind of common among pastry chefs that you'll work for just a handful of years. So I had like 3 years of experience from San Francisco, and then bam, there I am, the pastry chef. So that's not uncommon. It means that you end up with pastry chefs who don't necessarily have the breadth of experience that could really benefit your establishment. But I think a lot of chefs are just happy to hire someone with a couple years experience, because a lot of savory chefs, they don't want to have to worry about the pastry side of it. They just want to hand it off to somebody else. They don't want to spend too much money on that person's salary. And so it's just like, sure, you can get something done, just do your thing. So that's where I found myself, and I spent a couple years there at Stella Restaurant. And again, it was a really intense learning experience, because this time I was just kind of on my own, and I just had to figure it out. And this was another well-regarded restaurant, fine dining restaurant, and so now it was up to me to try and conceptualize desserts that would be up to the standards of the savory menu, and then try and train myself on the techniques that I didn't yet have to execute them. So yeah, it was it was intense. It was fun. Sometimes it was overwhelming and frustrating. I think, though, I really would have benefited at that point in continuing to work under people who had more experience than me. But New Orleans is a much smaller market, and there were fewer options if I wanted to stay in fine dining. And so I felt that this was my best option at the time, and so that's what I stuck with. And it was a great experience in its way. But later on, you know, I started getting a little burnt out towards the end of that. And I think I might have had a different experience in the whole thing if I'd been working under a more seasoned chef.
Right.
And I felt a little isolated there, you know, because it was just me in this kitchen.
And you didn't hire anyone, right?
I did end up hiring a couple people, and that was great. And I particularly had an assistant, Max, who was a French guy who had come over on a J1 visa. And what was really great there is that we were pretty close in age. He was only a couple years younger than me, but he had traditional French training. So he actually had a lot of knowledge that I didn't yet have. And we had a good dynamic because, I mean, I recognized that I only half knew what I was doing.
Right.
You know, I wasn't an expert. I was trying this. And he was completely without ego. So it was great that he was able to contribute his knowledge without, I don't know, he wasn't trying to like steal my position or something. He wasn't trying to show that he was better than me. But he was like, oh, well, what if we try this thing that I learned? And so then maybe he would show me this thing that I didn't know yet, but that he had experience with. And then there would be another item we're going to make that maybe he never learned because it's not a traditional French thing. So then I could show him something new. So we had a really great back and forth. I think both of us learned a lot from that.
That's nice.
Yeah, it worked out well.
Yeah, that's a perfect combination, like of also personal characteristics, right? Like, when you work.
We just meshed well.
Yeah,
and that's so much of it too. Like in kitchens, you're working under these very intense circumstances, and you're also just spending so much time with your coworkers. Like typically, you're in the kitchen for 12 or 14 hours a day. You're there with your handful of other cooks and chefs who are on the same shifts as you. And those are the people that you see all the time, right? When you get out, you're exhausted. So maybe you go and get a drink or something with them afterwards, and then you go collapse into bed and you come back and do it again the next day. So that's your world right there. So it's really so crucial that you get along well with these people, that you're comfortable with them, and that you have like a good energy with them. Otherwise, it'll just grind you down, you know? You need to support one another to kind of like keep going through the marathon.
Right.
Did you bring
What then did bring you to San Diego after that? How did it change? What was
there was a couple more a couple more stops along the way. So I think largely because I was feeling kind of isolated in New Orleans and wasn't really sure what steps I should be taking to advance my career on my own. I really could have used a mentor. I kind of started thinking that maybe it was time for me to make a change and not be working in restaurants anymore. And what did I want to do next? You know, I didn't really know. But my first thought was that, okay, I really want to live in New York City. You know, I grew up in the suburbs of New York City, but I never actually lived in the city itself. And it just seemed a natural progression to me that I could do anything in New York, right? There's opportunities for everything. So if I'm going to make a change, that's a good place to be.
So what place do you still feel like home? What is
New York. New York is always home. And I didn't realize how much that was true until I moved back there from New Orleans. And I really enjoyed living in San Francisco, living in New Orleans, traveling in New Zealand. But somehow when I landed back in New York, it just immediately was, oh, this is it. This is home. This is where I make sense and where, I don't know, I understand how this place works, you know? New Orleans back to New York. I moved to Brooklyn. And so I got another pastry job there because that's the skill that I had, right? And I had to make a living. So I was working with Dominique Ansel in Soho in his flagship bakery. And again, that was a really great experience. And I learned a tremendous amount working under him because he is incredibly talented. He also actually is an active mentor and trains the people under him. And that's what I'd been lacking. But I learned so much. I learned so much from working with him. I mean, Dominique Ansel is an incredible baker. And the other chefs who were working there, the sous chef and such, were just incredible. And it was amazing coming in each morning. I would get there at about 4 in the morning or 4:30 in the morning. And we would have to, because it takes a few hours to get the things like the croissants ready for that morning. And you have to stock up the whole pastry case. And then once all those baked goods are ready, then you have to do the cakes, the fancy individual cakes. So it takes some time to get it all done.
It's a lot of work. And for how many hours? Like if you wake up at 4 and then you...
Usually if I got there at 4, I should have been gone at around 2. But, you know, it depends on how well I got through my list that day.
Okay, but all croissants which are not been sold, what do you do to them? Do you keep them for the next day?
Oh, no, they usually were wiped out. We didn't have leftovers. I mean, everything would get, that wasn't a problem.
Okay, that was not a problem.
No,
bakery,
not at this bakery. The problem at this bakery is that on some days we would sell out of things too early. And people would come in, you know, at 11 o'clock looking for something and we'd be like, sorry, it's all gone. You know, you have to get here earlier. So after not even a year there, I stopped working in the bakery and I pivoted, but still within the food industry. So I had these couple of things that I was doing for these few years: food styling, food writing, and occasionally teaching. And it was a really fun combination of things. But at the same time, I knew it was kind of a stopgap. It was something to keep me, you know, fed and sheltered while I was figuring out what my next step truly was. Because none of these things were things that I saw myself doing for the rest of my life. They weren't things I wanted to make a career out of, but they were a lot of fun for a couple of years. But ultimately, you know, it was a time of a lot of soul searching, you know, trying to figure out, what do I want in life? What do I want to accomplish? What's important to me? I had actually never really seen myself sticking with one career for the majority of my life. I never was a person who knew this is what I want to do. I wanted to do everything. But I also recognized that, you know, time passes you by and you want to be able to look back and be proud of what you've done in the end. And so I wanted to identify what would I feel good about looking back on 50 years down the road. And I thought about, you know, the mentors in my life who had great influence on me. What was it about them that left such an impression? What did I admire about them? And for the most part, you know, these were mostly women in very disparate areas, you know, totally unrelated. But what they all had in common was that they were passionately committed to some pursuit which was meaningful in that it helped others. It wasn't a purely self-centered pursuit, not just about their own enjoyment, but it was, how can I give back and improve the world or the lives of the people around me? And as I thought about what I could do that was aligned with that, I kept coming back to science and animals. because that was always actually something that I really loved when I was younger. And it was something that I had missed while I was working in food and in restaurants. You know, when I was younger, I used to like volunteer in animal shelters. I ran educational summer programs on a farm in the Hudson Valley in the summers when I was in college. Actually, when I was in New Orleans, I continued to volunteer at the New Orleans Zoo, and I would literally, on my days off, I would go into the zoo and I would like scoop giraffe poop and help feed the zebras, because it was just such a, you know, I love being with the animals and working with them, and it was such a change of pace from my regular job.
Right.
And so as I tried to figure out what my next direction would be, I realized that I would really regret it if I never pursued something that like really allowed me to, I don't know, make the most of these interests of science and working with animals. And so I decided that if I pursued a science education, then I could do some kind of work that would contribute towards conservation. And so I actually went back to school while I was in New York, and I went part-time for a little bit and then full-time for a year, and I completed a bachelor's degree in biology so that I could then start applying to graduate programs.
But here's the question: did you have a bachelor's degree before, right? But in Italian, right? So you needed to get a new degree in biology. So you basically, after this pastry experience, you had to start over and prepare for a completely new field.
Yeah.
What challenges did you face at this period of time, and what helped you from your pastry experience to get ready for exams in biology?
So honestly, okay, the biggest challenges were probably that I felt really awkward going back to undergrad. I turned 29 the fall that I went back, so I was about 10 years older than a lot of the students who I was taking classes with. I think they probably didn't even notice as much, but I felt very conspicuous. I felt like I stuck out, so I felt awkward about that. But also then, you know, I was going to CUNY Brooklyn College, so it's one of the City University of New York schools. And since I was a New York City resident, I got resident tuition, and it was very reasonable in its costs, but it still had costs. And I had been living on a shoestring budget as a freelancer in these few different areas. And so it was a real challenge to try and make enough money to get by while still having enough to pay for, you know, a few classes per semester, and then putting the time necessary into these different things. You know, the first semester that I went back, I took college level intro biology, which that's great. I do well in that kind of course, and I just found it enjoyable. But I also took first level of calculus, which was not as great for me. I hadn't taken math in more than 10 years. You know, the last course I took was pre-calc, and I hadn't had to use any of it. So I'd completely forgotten all algebra, all trigonometry. I had no idea. So the amount of time I had to invest, I mean, thank goodness for Khan Academy online, because that's really what allowed me to refresh my skills. So yeah, it was a matter of balancing the time investment and schooling with the time investment necessary in continuing to work freelance so I could support myself. And I guess just getting comfortable with the fact that, like, okay, yeah, so I'm 10 years older than the people around me, but there's nothing wrong with that. Like, I've done things that I've really enjoyed in the meantime.
Yeah, but I think that for many people, that might be a stop sign, that I don't want to get back to school and start over. How can I make this finances work? And that's great that you decided to still pursue what you wanted to do, like be closer with the animals. So, like, did you know that you want to be working with more with the ocean, or was it back then? What was it?
Actually, that didn't even come up until I started applying to graduate schools. So it took me 2 years to do the bachelor's in biology, because all of my, you know, gen ed requirements transferred from my previous degree. So I just had to do the requirements for biology. And so in the second year of that, I was looking into graduate programs and beginning to, you know, consider what I needed to apply for them. And it honestly, I don't think focusing in marine science even occurred to me until I was looking at graduate programs. But then once it got on my radar, once I saw that, oh, I could do marine biology, that was just like, yep, that's what's happening. That's what I'm doing. Absolutely. There's just something about the ocean which I find so fascinating. That's all.
Okay, how many dolphins surround this area, approximately?
Tens of thousands, maybe even hundreds of thousands.
Like okay, let's say 1 or 2 miles from here.
1 or 2 miles, not so many. So there's a couple kinds who you'll see closest in here. The kind who you'll see closest to shore is usually the bottlenose dolphin, which is the one that most people are common with. So if you're surfing near the Scripps pier and some dolphins come cruising by you, those are probably bottlenose dolphins.
Okay.
But occasionally, even as close in as, you know, a kilometer or less, you'll see Pacific white-sided dolphins, which are these really beautiful kind of gray and white patterned dolphins. They have a very different shape of their head than bottlenose dolphins, so you would notice that there was something very different about them if you saw them. And then if you go out a little deeper, you're more likely to see common dolphins, and those you'll often see in groups of thousands, and you'll just see them all diving and swimming as they move along, or feeding in huge groups. And then you might also see smaller groups of one called Rizzo's dolphin, and they're also pretty distinctive looking. They have a very blunt nose. They have pretty much no beak at all, so it's just a melon and then a tiny little beak. And as they get older, they turn lighter and lighter in color, so the oldest ones are almost white, and it's largely because of scarring, because they kind of have battles with one another, and the males will fence and they'll rake their teeth along one another, so they end up with all these white crisscrossing scars, and by the time they're well advanced into maturity, they look almost white, so they're very distinctive looking. So I ended up actually only applying to 3 graduate programs. I applied to University of California at San Diego, UC Santa Cruz, and then University of Washington. And since I was coming in with only a bachelor's, some PhD programs require you to have a master's already before you can apply. So that narrowed the pool of where I could apply a little bit. But these happened to already be really great, outstanding programs in their field. So I felt good about applying to them, and I was glad that they didn't require the master's for entry.
Yeah, it's actually interesting to know. I didn't know that some of the programs may not require a master degree. I thought okay.
I think that's particular to the U.S. I think pretty much everywhere else in the world you need a master's in order to apply for the PhD. But here it's not uncommon to go from undergraduate right to a PhD and to complete a master's on the way, and that's what I've actually done. So in the first few years that I was in grad school, I was doing all the required coursework for my PhD and starting to do research, and that also satisfied the requirements for a master's. So I was able to kind of check that box, and now I'm trying to wrap up the PhD. I'm hoping I only have about a year left, but that might be optimistic.
But what helps you from your previous experience being like in a field? It's totally, to me, it's like a totally different environment. Right now you're working with the data. Before that you were working like in the field, in this kitchen with a lot of noise, smells, people around you. But what helps you from your previous experience in your current job?
I think that probably the things that I learned from working in restaurants are not to be afraid of hard work. I thought I knew, but I didn't know what hard work was until I was working in restaurants. And so, not to be afraid of hard work, not to be afraid of learning new things or feel like because you don't know something, that's not an option to you. The fact is you can always learn new things as long as you're open to it. And focus, and drive. The fact that once I've decided that I want to do something and that that's what's right for me, like I don't let anybody naysay me. I don't let things stand in my way. I understand the path might not always be completely straight. I don't know necessarily how I'll get to my goal always, but if I decide that that's where I want to be, then it's just a matter of step by step figuring out, okay, what will get me a little bit closer and a little bit closer, and being willing to see it through. So I think I learned most of that from working in restaurants from my first jobs.
When you decided to study biology and where you're at now, looking back, is it what you expected?
No, not at all, not remotely. I probably had some vision when I applied to marine biology graduate programs of diving with dolphins and coral, spending a lot of time in the water. No, this is completely different. I think one of the things that unfortunately undergraduate biology programs don't prepare you for necessarily are the statistical and computational skills, which are really necessary to be a researcher these days. We're kind of in like an era of big data. So the acoustic data we collect is enormous. We have petabytes of acoustic data stored in our lab. And so, the old way of listening to your acoustic data and manually noting every time you heard the vocalization of some whale species that you're trying to study, that's not possible anymore. You would never get anywhere. So I've had to spend a lot of time learning a lot more math. I've taken like all the calculus ever, which was like a shock for me. A lot more statistics and computational skills. And so learning how to code in a few different languages. I've been doing machine learning for the better part of the last year, which is something that not only did I never have any interest in, but I didn't think that it was something that I was capable of. I thought you had to have some certain, I don't know, proclivity, some certain like inherent talent to be able to do those kinds of things. And I never considered myself a computer person. Right. So I think it's been eye-opening just learning that all of these things are options if you're willing to put the time in and learn them, and willing to, like, you know, feel stupid sometimes along the way, or bang your head against a problem for a while, and then maybe eventually break through it. But
so that's okay, right?
That's like, okay, yeah. Just
and with your team, do you discuss this like a bigger problems, right? That keeps you, that helps you to keep your motivation up, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Because it's very know what you're doing, why you're doing this.
Right, and that's something that we have to remind each other once in a while. Like, maybe you've gotten stuck, you know, I don't know, down a wormhole over here, but hold on, is this actually helping you answer this question? Is it actually getting you towards that goal? So sometimes we need to help each other get unstuck a little bit. You know, if we've just been, you can get blinders on and you can just forget about everything else except trying to, but how do I make this work? And sometimes it helps to have a team member come along and say, wait, but do you need to have that work? Because aren't you trying to actually address this over here? So we try and keep each other sane and moving forwards so we're not stagnating.
Yeah. What do you think about the SeaWorld?
That's a a complicated topic. I'm not a fan of keeping whales in captivity for entertainment purposes. I don't think that we're able to provide them with the quality of life that they deserve as such intelligent creatures, animals which in the wild would roam over enormous areas and whose social structures are so complex. You know, in captivity, we'll take an orca captured wherever or bred up the coast in Washington and throw it in a tank with an orca bred in Florida. They don't know one another. They don't necessarily come from similar stocks. They don't necessarily have similar vocalizations. So it's like locking you in a room with somebody from another country who doesn't speak your language and expecting that you're going to be best of friends. It doesn't really work that way. So while I'm not a fan of keeping whales in captivity for these entertainment purposes, I also do need to recognize that SeaWorld does a lot of really good basic research, and they're also responsible for the marine mammal stranding response in Southern California. So when a wild animal washes ashore, they'll be the ones to go either try and get it back in the water or bring it to SeaWorld and rehabilitate it before they return it. Or if it's not able to be rehabilitated and returned to the water, then it'll probably stay in an aquarium somewhere. So it's essential work. I just wish that everybody could go back to the ocean where they came from.
Would you go with your kids to SeaWorld?
No, I probably wouldn't. No. I would try and take them out on ecologically responsible whale watching tours, because that's a great way to go out into the real habitat and see the animals in their natural setting, as long as you know that the operator of the tour is keeping respectful distances from the animals, not trying to get up and be too close to them. You know, it's much better if you can go out and let the animals approach you, and then you really see their natural behaviors instead of seeing them running away from you.
And I guess that we're living right now in such a beautiful time where we can also see everything online.
Yes.
And then, of course, going into the field and maybe see whales in the wild, but at the same time, if we want to know something more deeper, then we can watch the videos.
Yeah, I mean, I watch all of those, you know, Blue Planet and Planet Earth and Oceans, and I think they're amazing.
Which, is there any movie or documentary which would you recommend to watch?
I mean, I grew up watching National Geographic nonstop. You know, that's what I really loved. These days, all of these super high-definition shows like Planet Earth and Blue Planet, I think they're really amazing. If you want to understand maybe more about why keeping whales in captivity is problematic, there's a documentary called Blackfish. It's a tough thing to watch, but it also helps you understand the issues with keeping these animals in small confined tanks for their entire life and why that drives them to certain behaviors which have negative consequences for their trainers. I mean, some people have been killed, unfortunately, by these animals because the animals essentially they go psychotic. So, yeah, it's a heavy thing to watch. But I would say the most important thing you can do is watch these nature documentaries just to understand who's out there, what they're doing. It's incredible. They're beautiful. There's such a variety of life, and it gives you just a whole new appreciation for, you know, we look out at the ocean and we just see this flat blue surface. But the fact is, there's so much going on below the surface, and so much of it we will never see firsthand. And the best way we can experience it is by watching footage that somebody else has taken, oftentimes years of their life, to collect, to really see these animals in their environment doing their natural thing.
Yeah. I believe that also everyone has its own superpower, which helps them go through all the life challenges. Going back to your experience, going back to your life, all the cities you traveled, countries you traveled, what do you think helped you, or which drove you, like going through all the challenges? Which superpower helped you to be where you are right now?
I think not being afraid of failure, just accepting it as part of the process, because you'll never get anywhere if you're too afraid to try. And accomplishing any goal is going to entail doing things wrong and hitting dead ends sometimes. And that doesn't mean that you did something, that you made a bad choice or that you went down the wrong path. It's just part of the process. So I think accepting that and moving forwards in the face of what seems like failure, you can get anywhere as long as you're willing to just keep on moving.
Nice. That's interesting. Thank you so much.